Okay, so this is part two of our lecture on Elizabeth Loftus's eyewitness testimony research from 1975. I've switched to my headphones here, which hopefully will, this microphone will reduce some of the extraneous noise on the previous recording. Before we get into the second section, we had just finished up talking about sort of what the concept of a presupposition was. And I want to give you another example. There's a question that is often associated with Elizabeth Loftus as her own research, but this is actually something that she cites in this article, and it's often the sort of example that people give of what people mean when they say presupposition in a question. So, this is from the article on page 563, the very top of the page. And she gives the example of how fast was the car going when it ran the stop sign. That statement presupposes that there was a stop sign. If the stop sign didn't actually exist, then in answering the question, the subject might review, strengthen, or make more available certain memory representations corresponding to the stop sign. So that initial question is thought to influence a subsequent question, such as, did you see the stop sign? Um, so when confronted with that question, for example, how fast was the car going when it ran the stop sign, there's presupposed information built into that, notably that there was a stop sign. So I wanted to kind of give you that an example. And the thing that she raises, of course, is that what if those presuppositions are false? For example, what if there was no stop sign at the intersection? So now let's move into her discussion of the method for the experiments themselves. Okay, so these are four experiments that were all conducted at the University of Washington in Seattle, or UW as it's referred to by people. I used to do collaborative research out there with Virginia Tech. Um, Basically, all these experiments include people viewing films of these complex, fast-moving events. In three of the four examples, they're related to cars, and in one example, they're related to an incident in a classroom. So viewing of the film is followed by initial questions which contain presuppositions. Now in the first experiment, those presuppositions are true. That presupposition is true. In the subsequent experiments 2 through 4, there is a false presupposition in the question. So in experiment 1, the initial question either does or does not mention an object that actually was present in the film. Therefore, it is a true presupposition. And then a subsequent question a few minutes later inquired as to whether or not the subject had seen the existing object. In experiments 2 through 4, the initial questions were again asked immediately after the film, whereas there were some subsequent questions that were asked after a lapse of 1 week. Okay, so let's talk about experiment 1. In this first experiment, 150 University of Washington students, very much like yourselves and psychology students, were brought in groups of various sizes, and they were shown a film of a multiple car accident in which one car, after failing to stop at a stop sign, makes a right-hand turn into the mainstream of traffic. And in an attempt to avoid the collision, the cars in the oncoming traffic stop suddenly, and a five-car bumper-to-bumper collision results. And I'm sure you've all either experienced or you've observed something somewhat similar to this. One car has to stop unexpectedly, and then a series of cars behind it all stop unexpectedly, and there's this sort of fender bender process that just propagates down the line. So the film lasts less than a minute, and the accident occurs within a 4-second period. So this is a very fast-moving, very quick event. At the end of the film, there's a 10-item questionnaire administered, and a diagram of the situation is included, and it labels the car that ran the stop sign as A, and the cars involved in the collision as B through F. The first question asked about the speed of car A in one of two ways. In condition 1, it asked how fast was car A going when it ran the stop sign. So that's half of the sample receives that question. And then the other half of the sample in the second level of the independent variable receives the question, how fast was car A going when it turned right? So 75 subjects received the stop sign question, includes that presupposition of a stop sign, and then 75 received the turned right. And the last question is identical for all the subjects, and it says, did you see the stop sign for car A? And the subjects respond by simply circling yes or no in their questionnaire. So that's the structure of the experiment. So to bring it back to our discussion of experimental design, this is a single factor experiment, right? There's only one independent variable, and that it has two levels. That independent variable is whether or not there is a presupposition built into the initial question. In one level of the independent variable, there is this presupposition of the stop sign, and the other it's absent. Okay, so what did she find? So in the subjects that were in the stop sign group, those that had the question including the presupposition of a stop sign, 53% responded yes to the question, did you see the stop sign for car A? In the group that had the turn right only, that includes no presupposition of a stop sign, only 35% reported having seen the stop sign. And they tested this through a chi-square test, which is a simple test of the significant difference between two groups. And they found a p-value less than 0.05. And if you remember from previous discussions, that means that there is a 5% chance or less that the results that she observed were entirely due to chance and not due to her manipulation of the independent variable. So the wording of the presupposition into a question about an event asked immediately after the event takes place seems to influence the answer to the subsequent question concerning that presupposition itself. Now, of course, this was asked a very short time later in experiment 1, only a matter of minutes. But what it tends to do is the presupposition pushes the subject's recollection in the direction of confirming, not conforming, I apologize for the typo there, of confirming the supplied information. So she basically says there are two possible explanations for why this happens. And this is based on two theories of memory, essentially. The first possible explanation is that the stop sign questions resulted in what's called strengthened memorial representation. And I apologize if that's not easy to see there because of my video screen, but you can see that on the slides that are uploaded to the file section. Basically what she's saying is that by having that presupposition of a stop sign in the initial question, it strengthens the person's already existing memory of the event, their representation visually of the event. That is, strengthens it to include a stop sign. The opposing theory is what's called the construction hypothesis. And let me talk about each of these in a little bit of detail for a moment. So this is drawing from Professor Loftus's article in describing these two possible explanations. The first is that when the person is asked the question, that presupposition of the stop sign in half of the subjects that they received that question that included the stop sign presupposition, that it strengthens their available memory, the representation that corresponds to the stop sign. So later when asked, did you see the stop sign, the respondent strengthens that recall of the information. The second possibility is what she refers to as the construction hypothesis. Now this is an interesting idea, and this is a much more theoretical idea about the hypothetical construct of memory. How do we recall information? Essentially what the construction hypothesis says is that the subjects who are asked a question to remember something, they visualize or reconstruct in their mind that portion of the incident they need to answer the question. And so if you've already accepted the presupposition, you're introducing the stop sign into that visualization, whether or not it was in your memory. So when you're interrogated later about the existence of the stop sign, you respond on the basis of this earlier supplementation of the actual incident. The presupposition supplements your memory of the event. So in other words, as she puts it, the subject may see the stop sign that they themselves constructed. This would not tend to happen if the initial question refers only to a right turn. So the reason why she tends to focus on the construction hypothesis is because it has a very important consequence. So if you supply a piece of true information in the presupposition, that's great. You're strengthening the person's memory for that particular thing. You're emphasizing that thing in their memory representation of the event. But what if you supply a piece of false information? Okay? And this is where experiments 2 through 4 really come into play. She goes to an example in some previous research that she conducted along with another researcher named Palmer in 1974. And this was when they showed subjects a film of an automobile accident and followed it by questions about the events that occurred in the film. And some of the subjects were asked, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? Okay? The key word in that sentence is smashed. Now, another level of the independent variable involved people being asked a similar but importantly distinct question, which was, how fast was how fast were the cars going when they hit each other? So if you're paying attention, hopefully what you're recognizing is the substitution of the word smashed for the word hit. Now, what they found was that the word smashed had a impact on people's answers to a subsequent question. Now, the subsequent question was um, about the presence of broken glass at the scene of the accident that they witnessed in the film. Now, in the video, in the film they witnessed, there was no broken glass. There was no broken glass shown. What they found, though, was that people who were asked the question about how fast were the cars going when they smashed into one another were more likely to report the presence of broken glass than those who were asked how fast were the cars going when they hit each other. And this is very interesting because this is a false presupposition. There was no broken glass present in the film that people witnessed in this previous study that she's citing. So what they're saying is that on hearing the smashed question, some subjects reconstruct the accident through this construction model of memory in their minds, and they are integrating new information into that existing representation. And if so, the word smash tends to be more severe. You know, our connotation of the word smashed is more severe than our connotation of the word hit in language. And so as a result, those people that hear that more severe word smashed are much more likely to include broken glass in their answer to the question. So this idea that you can introduce a false presupposition is what leads us to these subsequent experiments after experiment 1. So just to clarify that for a moment, keep in mind experiment 1 includes a true presupposition about the stop sign. These subsequent experiments 2 through 4 include false presuppositions. Okay, so let's talk about experiment 2. In this case, again, 40 undergraduate students. Now, it's a smaller sample, but it is still undergraduate students at the University of Washington. Again, in these groups of various sizes, were shown a 3-minute videotape taken from the film Diary of a Student Revolution. Okay, and I don't know anything about this film, but there is a scene in which there's a disruption of a class. So 8 demonstrators come into a classroom and disrupt the class. And then there's a confrontation, which is a noisy verbal confrontation, and ultimately the demonstrators leave the classroom after this confrontation. So at the end of the videotape, the subjects receive one of 2 questionnaires containing 1 key and 19 what are called filler questions, okay? So we've talked before about demand characteristics and the idea that you don't want to make it entirely obvious to the subject exactly what it is you're studying or investigating. Sometimes you need to provide some sort of, it's not necessarily deception in this case, but you want to provide a little noise to distract the person from maybe what your specific interest is, to avoid them discerning what your ultimate hypothesis or theory might be, and therefore giving you the answer you want to hear. And that's really the essential definition of a demand characteristic is, does the question or the interview or the questionnaire, the method in some way tell the subject to respond in a specific way, either to make you happy or to just sort of conform. In some cases, it can be quite the opposite. People who might just, as a natural resistance to authority, might be predisposed to give you wrong answers or to not answer the question the way they think you want it to be answered. So in this case, the questionnaire includes 19 filler questions, but the important question, the key question, is distinguished in the 2 levels of the independent variable by the number that's included in the question. Okay, so to clarify that, the key question for half of these 40 students, 20 of the students, is, was the leader of the 4 demonstrators who entered the classroom a male? Whereas the other half of the class receives, was the leader of the 12 demonstrators who entered the classroom a male? And then the subjects respond by circling yes or no. Now, what's happening there is that initial question is introducing 2 different false presuppositions. If you go back to the first bullet point here, in the actual film the students were shown, there were 8 demonstrators. And there are 2 levels of the independent variable, both of which present a false presupposition. In the first condition of the independent variable, they are presented with 4 demonstrators in the question. In the second level of independent variable, they're presented with 12. So it's either over or under presupposition about the actual number, which was 8. So now there is a time delay introduced, which I think was really done to make this a little more externally valid, to make this a little closer to how eyewitness testimony is often gotten at. whether it's through a subsequent interview, through law enforcement, through insurance investigators, or in a courtroom setting. So all of these subjects return 1 week later, and they are not shown the videotape again, and they're answered a series of 20 new questions about the disruption, and they're urged to answer the questions of memory and not to make any inferences. And the critical question, of course, in those 20 questions, there's 19 filler again. The one key question is, how many demonstrators did you see entering the classroom? Okay, so what did she find? Subjects who had previously been asked the 12 question reported an average of 8.85 people a week earlier. Now, again, that's pretty close to, on average, to the actual number, but slightly exaggerated, right? 8.85, almost one full person over the actual number that they viewed. Whereas those that were asked the 4 question, how, of the 4 demonstrators was the leader a male, they recalled 6.40 people on average. That's the mean for both of those groups. Now, there's something you see here. This is a statistic called a t-test, which is a good inferential statistic for examining whether or not there's a statistically significant difference between 2 groups. And in this case, there is a statistically significant difference, p-value less than 0.01. And just to reiterate, remember, that means there is a 1% or less chance that these types of results will be found purely due to chance, just due to random error. The actual number, if you recall, was 8. Okay, so she actually did some subsequent analyses, and she noticed that 10% of each of the people in each group, the 4 or the 12, so now if you think about 10% of a group of 20, so 2 of the people in each group answered with the actual suggested number. So she found there were 2 people within each group that said either 4 or 12. They wholeheartedly reported the suggested false presupposition of either 4 or 12. What she did then is she removed these subjects from the analysis, because essentially you could make the alternative explanation, and I'm going to emphasize that in a moment, that, well, these people were simply suggested this number in the question, and therefore they're reporting that number. So what she's saying is I'm going to pull those out to see if I still find this difference, and she does. It still results in a statistically significant difference amongst the responders. And this demonstrates that recall of a specific number in the questionnaire is not an adequate alternative explanation for the results. The reason why I'm emphasizing this is because I want you to think back to our last lecture about experimental design. The very beginning of that lecture talked about how experimental design is essentially utilized when you want to make a strong causal argument. And the cause and effect argument that you make involves the 3 prongs of causation we discussed. And the 3rd prong of causation is the elimination of alternative explanations. So this is a very good real-world example of Professor Loftus trying to make sure that a subsequent reviewer of this article or reader of this article who comes along, they may have the argument, well, you simply suggested to people there were 4 or 12, and that's why they answered 4 or 12. So she eliminates people who parroted back that exact number and still finds the results. This is a very good example of doing your diligence in the analysis. So the results of this second study show that a question containing false numerical presupposition can, on average, affect the witness's answers to a subsequent question about a quantitative fact. In this case, how many demonstrators were there? Okay, let's talk about experiment 3. The slightly larger sample on this one, 150 students at the University of Washington, again in groups of various sizes. They view a brief videotape of an automobile accident, and then they answered 10 questions about the accident. The critical question, 9 filler questions, 1 critical question is, how fast was the white sports car going when it passed the barn while traveling along the country road? That is one level of the independent variable. They receive a false presupposition in the question about a barn. Half of the group is asked the sort of control condition that doesn't involve the false presupposition, which simply asks, how fast was the white sports car going while traveling along the country road? So as you can tell from reading those 2 sentences, the real distinction there is that in the first false presupposition condition, there is this statement about passing a barn. In fact, there is no barn in the scene. Okay, so in the video they viewed, there was no barn present. All of the subjects returned 1 week later, and without reviewing the videotape, answered 10 new questions about the accident. 9 filler questions, 1 key question. The final one is, did you see a barn? And the subjects respond by circling yes or no in their questionnaires. Okay, so what were the results? Of the subjects earlier exposed to the question containing the false presupposition of a barn, 17.3 responded yes when later asked. Now, 17.3, less than 1 in 5 responded yes, I saw a barn. That's not necessarily noteworthy until you look at the results for the subjects who received no false presupposition of a barn. Only 2.7% of those remaining subjects claimed to have seen it. So this is a highly statistically significant result, a p-value of less than 0.01 based on a chi-square test. So in this case, she concludes from this study, from this experiment in the study, that an initial question containing a false presupposition can influence a witness's later tendency to report the presence of a non-existent object corresponding to that presupposition. Okay? So if you're following what we're going through here, and I think the reason why I chose this article to review in the class, first of all, it comes right on the heels of us talking about experimental design, and I think Professor Loftus did an excellent job in her design of these experiments. She keeps it very simple. She varies one variable. These are all single factor experiments essentially, and she does a wonderful job of the procession of these experiments. They each add one layer of complexity or something a little different to draw the conclusions further along as to what it implies for the theory itself. So in this third one, we're now introducing this false presupposition of something that was not there at all. In the subsequent experiment, there were protesters, but the number is where the false presupposition exists. Now we're finding that you can influence people's answers about a non-existent object. Now, 17.3%, again, is not all of the subjects, but it is substantial compared to the control group of only 2.7%. So this last experiment extends the finding a little bit more, and it asks whether or not this effect is wholly due to the word barn having occurred or not occurred in the earlier session. So if this is the case, then merely asking about a non-existent object could increase the tendency to report the existence of that object. And this could account for the results of experiment 3. It could just be simply asking about it is what's causing it. And in a sense, you're suggesting that there was one. Now, experiment 4, which we'll discuss in the next final and third part of this lecture, tries to take it one step further to increase the evidence for what Professor Loftus wants to argue is a construction theory of memory. So I'll see you for part 3.